Hello, friends. My honorable guest today is Philip Pilkington. Philip Pilkington is a research analyst working in investment management and focusing on macroeconomic research. Hi, Phil, and thank you for participation in this vlog.
Hi, Ruslan. Thanks for having me.
Philip is also author of research named The Risk of Decoupling and De-risking. You can find the link on this down description of this video. In this research, Philip raises very important questions about the risks of dividing and fragmenting global economy and possible even deglobalization. So my first question is the next. In your research, Philip, you showed very clearly that the United States and the European Union remain very dependent on imports, and this applies not only to consumer goods or raw materials, but also to means of production. It was very surprising for me. Machines, tools, technologies that are supplied from other countries. Then why is the United States under Trump and Biden also and the European Union still gradually implementing the policy of decoupling? What are their true motives? How do you think?
Well, it's a big question. As you say, the research shows quite clearly that we're not just dependent on countries like China or other countries in the world for just consumer goods, laptops, smartphones, and so on, but also for capital goods or means of production, as you say. And I mean, I'm sure your listeners can imagine what would happen if you cut off a supply of capital goods or means of production. It would shut down the production process, and that doesn't just mean new capital goods. It also means replacement parts and so on. If a piece of factory equipment is made in China or a piece of construction equipment is made in China, the parts are going to come from China as well. So that's very clear if you look at the data, and I'd encourage your viewers to go and have a look at the data that we've run, because I think we're the first ones to do it. Why is this happening then? Well, I think we describe it a little bit in the paper. We describe the process of this. It's a funny thing. I think often in politics and in policy, people always kind of look for a very coherent motive behind something, and sometimes things just get a little bit crazy or out of control. And I think the story here basically is the story that we tell in the piece, in the essay. Basically when Donald Trump got elected in 2016, he highlighted something that had been ignored in America for a very long time, and that was a very, very large trade deficit. And the largest trade deficit that America was running was with China. Now, they had trade deficits with other countries like Japan and still do, but China was particularly large. Trump had been concerned with trade deficits going right back to the late 1980s, when Japan started to run very large, or the United States started to run very large trade deficits with Japan. Now, when Trump introduced this, it was sort of a personal, I won't say a personal gripe, but it was something that he was concerned with for a long time. He wasn't the only one. There were other political figures in America like Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan in the 1990s, but it had never been mainstream. And so as we discuss in the paper, they didn't really have anyone to do the policy on it. So Trump's son-in-law and then advisor Jared Kushner went and tried to find somebody who could deal with this, who had some credentials, and that ended up being Peter Navarro, who was a fairly unknown figure who was writing, I think he was a professor in California, professor of business or economics at a business school, and he was writing books on this. So they brought him into the fold. Now, funnily enough, I was somewhat involved in this through the Journal American Affairs. The Journal American Affairs, of which Gladden Pappan, whom you know as well, who works at the Institute as well, were very concerned with these issues of trade. And we wanted to look at how, I was only a contributor now while I was working in finance, but I was quite close to the editors. And we wanted to look into kind of like, how would you solve this problem for the United States? And I think certainly my direction, and I think it's fair, American Affairs too, was very concerned with industrial policy, with maybe government subsidies and so on to try and grow industry to compete on the global stage. Anyway, what happened was that in it's a long story, but I think industrial policy proved to be very difficult. Now, some industrial policy has been put through in the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration, and especially embedded in that in the CHIPS Act, the Semiconductors Act. Those are industrial policies, and I think they're quite productive because the trade deficit is a problem. It's not just some silly thing that Trump came up with. It is a genuine problem, and these trade imbalances are a problem. But really, it's very difficult to do industrial policy, and it's much, much easier to launch trade war, engage in tariffs, and blocking imports and so on. So I think it's just that the Trump highlighted the issue, and because there wasn't a ready set of solutions, people reached for the easiest option. Now, that's problematic for the US because I'm not against some protectionism personally, but using it as a general policy to go to economic war, I think, is a very bad idea if you have the trade debt, if you're the one that's dependent on the other person. So it's not a very good idea. And then that raises the question of Europe, because while the United States ran large trade deficits and certainly ran a large trade deficit with China, this was not true of Europe. Europe has, well, until recently, has a trade surpluses. Now, due to the cutting off of Russian gas after the war in Ukraine, Europe may have problems with their manufacturing. But when this debate started, Europe had a pretty balanced trade account. And so why are Europe being pulled into this debate? I don't know. I think everyone's been very confused and thrown off, especially by the war and so on. It's a very chaotic period, and leaders are just kind of looking for leadership, and they hear the Americans saying one thing and they follow down that path. Now, if it's a bad idea for America, it's a terrible idea for Europe, because Europe have a much, much more trade-oriented economy. America's actually quite a closed economy, not fully, but it's quite closed. And if you've ever visited there, you'll see that many things are made in America. And often it's of lower quality than in Europe, actually, because they have these protectionist, not hard protectionist, but soft protectionist measures in place. You can still buy Japanese cars. You occasionally see European cars in America, but not very much. You don't see German fridges, household appliances, and so on. But Europe is a very open economy, and that's why it produces such good quality products, or has until now. So I think my summary would be, this is a not very good idea for America, but it's a terrible idea for Europe. And I think that the reason that they're following down the path is just because they haven't thought it through. So we're hoping that papers like this will get a little bit more attention, especially in Europe, and make European leaders just think, okay, what are we actually doing here? What's the plan? Is it viable? Et cetera, et cetera.
And the second surprise for me was that BRICS country, still developing country, are less dependent from the import now than even this developed country like European Union or North American country. And do your research. And where might this policy of division, decoupling, lead the European Union and the United States in the long run? What will be possible losses of this policy? How do you think?
Well, the problem is, as you say, so back in the 90s and early 2000s, the BRICS countries, what we now call the BRICS countries, that's a kind of a new term, and especially given that they're actually forming into a serious group of some sort, it's a relatively new term. But those countries, and we're talking mainly about China, but, Russia's still a large economy. India's a large economy. Brazil is actually quite a large economy. And now they've added these other energy producers like Saudi Arabia and so on, which is very important. Although not a huge economy, it's one of the major oil producers in the world. This bloc used to import, as our research shows, enormous amounts of goods. And this is a perpetual problem in development economics, that in order to develop, a country needs equipment. It needs means of production, capital goods. And without that, obviously, it can't make anything, and it remains poor, and it remains an agricultural economy. So they were importing a lot of this stuff. So think of it this way: if you don't have means of production in your economy, you need to import the means of production to make stuff yourself, and you need to import the goods that you can't produce for yourself. And so you tend to run very, very large imports. That's always, if you ask a development economist, that's always the problem they'll encounter if they go to a poor country in the Caribbean or something like that. And so we've got used to the notion that these countries import a lot relative to us, but that's no longer true. And I think the reason for this is the rise of China. China did import a lot of stuff when it was developing, but now it's pretty much developed its own economy. It's not as rich as the West, obviously, but I think we can all see that China has a very powerful economy that can easily produce, I mean, basically anything, really. And it can compete with us on most products now. Not all, but most. And so China's been able to provide an alternative means of export for these countries. So they've become their own kind of cohesive bloc. So then that raises the second part of your question, which is what would happen if we start throwing up tariff walls and so on? Well, look, if you don't produce a product domestically and you're importing it from abroad, and then you try and put measures in place to stop the importation of that product, there'll be a shortage of that product, right? It's simple. I mean, think of what's happened with since the war with Russian gas. There was gas shortages until we were able to replace it with LNG. The same is true for anything: laptop computers, capital goods, means of production, anything like that. And so what will happen is exactly what we saw after the start of the war: inflation. Now, that was mainly energy-related inflation, but you could get other types of inflation too. You could get inflation coming through the system because you can't supply the spare parts for your machinery. You could get it just simply because, you know, we don't have the production capacity to supply everybody with a cheap iPhone or a smartphone, and they buy these cheap Chinese ones. So that would drive up prices too. Now, the thing is, we saw some inflation from cutting off of Russian gas after the start of the war, but that would be nothing compared to cutting off all the Chinese goods. I mean, just go to the shop and see how much stuff you just see that's made in China, made in China. That stuff would disappear, presumably. And you don't even need, the other thing is that I think some people, the protectionist people who support this policy, often non-economists, think that if you engage in protectionism, we'll just magically start producing this stuff ourselves. Now, you will eventually start producing this stuff yourself, presumably, but it takes time. And I'd especially highlight the problem that if a lot of your capital goods and means of production are tied to the import lines, you could have a real problem kickstarting your manufacturing sector and so on, because you'll have to go right back to basics, figuring out how to make machine tools, everything. I mean, it's stuff that I think the West has forgotten how to make maybe 30 years ago. So the short answer to your question is inflation. I mean, we'd see serious inflation, probably a lot worse than we've seen in the past few years. And the inflation in the past few years has been extremely damaging. I'll just say one last thing. You don't even need a full-blown economic war to get really bad effects. In response to some of the measures put in place by the Biden administration, the Chinese put two rare mineral elements on, I guess, minerals or whatever you want to call them, on a list. They were gallium and germanium. And they didn't actually ban these, but by putting them on the list, they made a threat. You know, they said, if you continue on down this path, maybe we'll start restricting these things. Now, this shows really clearly the interconnections here. So gallium and germanium aren't actually they're not rare in and of themselves, but they both require very large industry. One of them it's an offshoot of the zinc industry, the zinc processing industry. And the other is the bauxite industry, which makes aluminium, or aluminum, as the Americans call it. Now, once you have a large aluminium manufacturing sector and a large zinc manufacturing sector, you get lots of this stuff. But we don't have them anymore. And those industries take 10 years to build up. You know, they take years to build up. And the problem is that gallium and germanium are absolutely core to most electronic products we make in the West, including military equipment. And so I think the Chinese were quite clever, and they were showing, look, if you guys keep this up, we can ban really important elements in your supply chain. And I think that will give you a sense of the complexity of this stuff. Even something that's a very small amount of imports could have a hugely disproportionate impact.
And if you have such a significant risk of inflation and at the same time you have a very huge level of a state debt, is it double risk? From macroeconomic side, if you have a huge inflation and huge debt, what is going on in the end?
It depends. I mean, the funny thing about macroeconomics is that inflation is actually quite good if you have too much debt,
To
because the
sell, of
debt,
course. To sell
the
something to
debt.
tax is, of course, it's very good.
But the problem is, I think the key problem there is a slightly separate issue. That is, how have we managed to support the enormous debt loads in some countries? Not all countries. Europe isn't too bad. America is quite bad. The United Kingdom is quite bad. Japan is too, but it's a different story. How do they support? How does the US support, especially its foreign debt? It's because it has the dollar as the reserve currency. Well, that's another risk we haven't mentioned in the paper. But if you started a huge economic war on a global scale, especially with China, there's a chance that they could start dumping their dollar reserves and their holdings of United States government debt. So that's a different I think. I mean, when at the beginning of the Ukraine war, when the West, the Europe and America seized the Russian foreign exchange reserves, I mean, imagine China can do that to America, because they have enormous amounts they have enormous amounts of dollar reserves, or they can dump their dollar reserves, or they can do all sorts of things. So this raises another question of economic war. I think the overall message that I'm trying to get across here is that if you've been running a trade deficit for 30 years or 40 years, which is what the United States has done and what some European countries, not all, have done, you're in a very weak position. Actually, you don't have to be. You can get out of it. You can engage in reforms, but you're not in a big position to start economic wars. It's a bit like if the other guy has a big army and you've got a small army, and you go, well, that's not a good idea. You know what I mean? It's like China have the financial power from running the trade surpluses. We're extremely dependent on them, I think, more so than they are on us. And we are trying to start a fight. I don't think an economic fight. And I don't think that that's a good idea. In fact, I think that's a really dangerous idea. And the only reason that we're contemplating it is because we don't fully understand the circumstances.
Few days ago, I'm back from China. I was talking with a lot of Chinese economic experts, and almost all of them talking that we see that economic cooperation between countries within BRICS or within Europe, North American bloc, economical bloc, continues to grow. This became especially clear against the backdrop of sanctions against Russia, which lead to a sharp increase in its trade with China, more than doubling in 2 years. Are we really on the verge of forming two global economic blocs, separated, decoupled by sanctions and trade restrictions? How do you think?
I think the sanctions, the Western sanctions, have definitely sped up the creation of the BRICS. I think everybody recognizes that now. I said that very early on, and people got angry at me, but it's just a fact. I mean, that's just what's happening now, and we have to accept that because it's reality. I think all this idea of the blocs that we're hearing, this is coming from the same people who want to push decoupling. This is coming from the advocates of decoupling. And so when they say the world is going to form into blocs, they're thinking to themselves, we want to form the world into blocs. I don't think the Chinese want to do that at all. There is no evidence that the Chinese want to start engaging in aggressive trade practices with the West. They only see it as a response to what we're doing. And I think there's a little bit of confusion here on everybody's part. As I said, I think the world, because it's become so chaotic, people are making, assumptions and all this kind of stuff. But there's no doubt about it that the BRICS are becoming more integrated. And what we saw reported actually last week in the Financial Times is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is now basically saying that the economic growth strategy moving forward for China is going to be high-end exports, mainly to the global south, as they call it. Now, that's a lot of BRICS countries, but also non-BRICS countries, but potential future BRICS members, I'd imagine. And so this is something that the economist David P. Goldman, the American economist, has called the sinification of the global south, where China's just kind of taking over the entire trade in the region. And it's not very difficult to do if you can go in there with very low cost products, and also provide some of these poor countries with 5G infrastructure and so on. The Chinese have been very tactical about what they've developed, but they don't want to form blocs. I think they are moving in this direction because they see the West trying to engage in bloc formation. And as I said, I don't think all of this is malign or anything. I just think that people are very spooked by the war and very rattled by it, and so they're taking steps that may not be wise. But the point of my work is that you're not going to form blocs. It's too interdependent. So think of it this way: the interdependencies that have been formed that we show in the paper have taken about 30 years of what we've called globalization, or you might call hyperglobalization. There's probably been too much of it at this stage, but it's 30 years worth of globalization. You can't get rid of that in 3 years. Yeah. Maybe you can wind that back in 30 years if you make a big effort to do it, but you can't wind it back in 3 years. So I don't think that this bloc formation is going to work. And I think that's why a lot of these advocates started off talking about decoupling. And then they said, oh, well, that's actually too much. And they moved back to de-risking, which nobody has kind of defined or anything. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, economic war is economic war. If you launch a trade war on your opponent, they'll launch a trade war on you, and it'll cycle. We saw this in the 1930s. I don't think it'll happen, because I think if we start trying to do this, our economies will start to collapse with a lack of imports, especially in the capital goods and intermediate goods sectors. And I think the business people will just call up the politicians and just say, if you want to collapse the economy, keep doing this, but if you don't. And I just prefer that we didn't move in that direction at all, because I know it's just not going to work and it's not going to end well. So short answer to your question, I don't think the blocs thing is going to happen. I think the blocs rhetoric is coming out of people who are advocating, in a sense, for some sort of a decoupling.
And it's a possible dangers to image us that you can do this very, very long. What do we need to do to maintain economic connectivity in this world?
The paper is not a pro-globalization paper. I mean, as I've indicated, I think that Trump was correct to highlight problems with the trade deficit, and I think that's being taken seriously now. And it's not going in a very good direction at the moment, but in a sense, it's good that it's been highlighted. I wish we'd been more careful about it. I wish that we had a plan in place before we started talking about this, but we are where we are. So basically, I'm definitely not advocating for a return to 1990s style globalization. I don't think that would be a good idea. Although it would be better than decoupling. It would. Okay. It would, just to return back to normal of 5 years ago or 2015 would be better than decoupling, but it's not optimal. So what we probably want is a strategy of relative economic openness, but geared toward the national interest of every country that pursues it. So if any country in the world, and countries to a large extent do this anyway, but it would just be kind of formalizing it as the official structure. So you shouldn't really want to overindulge in protectionism, but at the same time, you don't want to engage in trade relationships that are clearly destroying your domestic industry. So in the case of the United States, for example, I'd see this as maintaining their trade relations as they are now, basically, maybe even get rid of some of the trade restrictions they've put on China, but then do things that actually make sense, rather than just kind of trying to punch at the Chinese. Say, okay, what strategic industries do we need? Okay, if it's semiconductors, then we should engage in an industrial policy focused on semiconductors. Of course, they've started that with the CHIPS Act, so there is precedent for this, and there could even be room for tariffs in this. I mean, I saw that the Biden administration last week announced that it was considering raising tariffs on on imported steel. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that you could easily communicate that, for example, to the Chinese, or I think who else sells it, to the Brazilian sell steel, and you could just say to them, look, we need our own domestic steel. This isn't economic warfare, but we need our own domestic steel industry. And maybe they have to engage in some counter tariffs, but everybody understands that it's a strategic it's a strategically targeted thing, and there needs to be communication on that. So for a big country like America, I think it's kind of industrial policy plus, just highlighting key industries that really need to be kept on board, and keeping those industries as simple as possible. Steel is steel is steel. America can make steel, but if you have, I'll give you an example. In Britain, I used to live in Britain, and they were trying to build a nuclear power station, and they'd lost the capacity to do it themselves, which is very sad because Britain built the first nuclear power station in the 1950s, I think. But they'd lost the capacity to do it, and the only ones really lining up to do it were the Chinese and the French. The French are still pretty good at nuclear power, and the Chinese are good at it too. And the French were too expensive. They couldn't afford it. And so they went with the Chinese, but then under Theresa May, they said, well, we can't have the Chinese building the nuclear power station. Well, now there's an energy crisis and nobody has a nuclear power station. So I'm not advocating that the Chinese should build the British power station. I don't know. I don't know the security concerns. I don't know. But I'm just saying that, you should be open. You should be open to connections like that, because you can't just turn on, like Britain. I think people thought, oh, well, we'll just build our own, or we'll get the French. No, there wasn't any money to do it. So you need to think a little bit more strategically. Then for small countries, it needs to be different. Okay, a smaller country isn't going to be able to compete on the world stage or create its own industrial base. Okay, most of them. I mean, some can. A mid-sized country like Germany certainly can. And maybe France, but anything smaller than that is going to have to take a very different approach. Those economies are just going to have to remain relatively open. They almost, I mean, in Budapest, where we are at the moment, the economy is completely, but I mean, not completely, but it's very heavily reliant on German automotive industries, and they're even feeling out bringing in Chinese electric vehicle producers. I think BYD are now building a factory here. But Hungary doesn't really have an alternative model. It's a country of 10 million people. They can't create their own industry or have an industrial policy. They need to be a hub for inward investment. The same is true of Ireland, where I'm from. I mean, there's no way Ireland can have its domestic car industry. It's a country of just 5 million people. So those countries need this inward foreign direct investment, and they need to be open to the world to sell the products that they're competitive with. So I think it'll be different strategies for different countries. I think what I see the connectivity brand as saying is, don't be ideological, don't pursue free trade for the sake of free trade, but don't pursue protectionism for the sake of protectionism. Don't be ideological, act in your national interest, and be pragmatic. And that'll mean different things for America. It'll mean different things for Hungary. It'll probably mean different things for Ukraine, different things for France. And I just think just be completely pragmatic and act in your national interest, and use any tool that you can. I think really that's the message of the project.
Thank you, Philip, for participation in this vlog. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, friends, for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I strongly recommend reading Philip's study, The Risk of Decoupling and De-risking, in the link in the down of this video. Thank you very much. Thank you, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan, for having me.